At 1:47 a.m. on June 6, 1951, Corporal James Dalton crouched in a frozen trench on Hill 487, staring into the pitch-black Korean mountains just 80 yards ahead. The air was brutal, cutting through layers of wool and canvas, carrying the smell of spent cordite and frozen earth. He wasn't watching for silhouettes or listening for bootfalls. Those signs came too late in this war. He was waiting for the silence to break with whistles and bugles. That sound meant the Chinese were coming. And when they came, it would be a human avalanche designed to bury everything in its path. His platoon, Baker Company of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, was holding the western ridge of Hill 487, a strategic position overlooking the supply route to the Watchone Reservoir. Intelligence reported the Chinese were planning a massive night assault to push the undermanned Americans off the high ground and sever the supply line. Dalton's position sat in exposed salient, a bulge in the defensive line that jutted dangerously forward. Every lieutenant knew it was a death trap waiting to spring. The rifle leaning against a frozen sandbag wasn't a weapon he was supposed to carry. Every other man in his platoon carried the M1 Garand, the 8-round semi-automatic workhorse that fired the powerful .30-06 cartridge. The Garand was a weapon of industrial might, designed for sustained volume and battlefield reliability. It was loud, heavy, and absolutely dependable. But Dalton's rifle was different. It was a bolt-action Remington Model 722 chambered in .222 Remington. A rifle his platoon sergeant had called a pea shooter, and his company commander had dismissed as utterly inadequate for combat. The ridicule wasn't subtle, and it wasn't friendly. The mockery had started 3 weeks earlier at the replacement depot in Pusan. Every soldier was inspecting their M1 Garands, the familiar 8-pound steel comforting in its military uniformity. Dalton was carefully assembling his Remington, a rifle he'd brought from Montana, where he'd won the state varmint shooting championship 2 years running. Sergeant Kowalski walked past and stopped cold. "What in God's name is that, Corporal?" The sergeant barked, pointing at the slender rifle and the tiny brass cartridges scattered on Dalton's bedroll. "You planning on shooting prairie dogs or Chinese soldiers?" Dalton explained calmly. It was a Remington 722 chambered in .222 Remington, built for extreme accuracy and speed. He modified the trigger himself and had hand-loaded every round he carried. The sergeant laughed, a harsh sound that drew the attention of the entire squad. "A .222? Son, that's a goddamn varmint round. You're going up against men who've been fighting since you were in diapers. That little mouse gun won't even penetrate their winter coats." The .222 Remington was technically one of the fastest small-caliber rounds ever designed. Built for a single purpose, velocity. The tiny 50-grain bullet exited the barrel at nearly 3,200 feet per second, a screaming supersonic projectile. Compared to the Garand's heavy .30-06 round, the .222 was an absolute specialist. It was a rapier where the Garand was a broadsword. The problem, as every combat veteran understood, was that small-caliber rounds had a critical flaw in warfare. They lacked stopping power. The experts, the battle-hardened NCOs, the weapons instructors at Fort Benning, all agreed. In combat where engagement happened at under 200 yards, you needed mass and momentum. You needed a heavy bullet that could punch through thick clothing, webbing, and bone. The .222, with its light construction and extreme speed, was known to fragment unpredictably and lose energy rapidly. Lieutenant Marcus called Dalton into a command bunker. He didn't shout. He simply looked at Dalton with the exhausted eyes of a man who'd already lost too many soldiers. "Corporal, I respect your marksmanship record. I hear you can hit a dime at 300 yards. But you're carrying a bolt-action rifle with a 5-round magazine, while every other man has an 8-round semi-automatic Garand. You have to manually cycle the bolt between shots. You are reducing the total firepower of this platoon. You will leave that sporting rifle with supply and draw a standard-issue M1. Is that understood?" Dalton saluted. "Yes, sir." He left the lieutenant's bunker, walked straight back to his tent, and promptly buried the assigned Garand under his sleeping bag. He kept the Remington. Dalton knew something the officers didn't. The war in Korea wasn't just about sustained fire. It was about immediate effect and psychological shock. The .30-06 round killed by punching through tissue and bone. The victim often had time to keep moving, throw a grenade, or fire a final desperate shot. Dalton was operating on a different theory entirely. When a bullet travels at over 3,000 feet per second and strikes flesh, it creates hydrostatic shock. The kinetic energy doesn't just penetrate, it radiates outward in a devastating pressure wave, liquefying tissue and shutting down the central nervous system instantly. The wound cavity was 3 times the bullet diameter. It was like detonating a small explosive inside the human body. The speed meant instant incapacitation. No forward momentum, no dying charge, no last grenade. Just immediate collapse. The fastest small caliber rifle in the theater, he reasoned, could stop a human wave attack faster than the heaviest automatic weapon. He spent the last 36 hours before the expected assault preparing in isolation. He wasn't cleaning cosmoline like the other men. He was hand-loading his 60 precious rounds of .222 Remington. These weren't factory military rounds. They were hollow point varmint bullets modified for maximum expansion and energy transfer. They were designed to dump every ounce of kinetic force into the target in the most catastrophic way possible. He wrapped the bolt assembly in thin wax cloth to prevent ice formation. He checked the trigger, tuned back in Montana to break crisp at 2.5 pounds. He checked the scope, a low-power Weaver optic, already collecting frost in the sub-zero cold. He kept the bolt action impossibly smooth, lubricating it with synthetic oil that wouldn't freeze or gum up. His entire defensive strategy consisted of 2 5-round magazines and the ability to work the bolt faster than any marksman in the regiment. His 10 shots had to be 10 kills before the enemy could close the distance. He had to be an impenetrable barrier. At 0145 hours, the waiting ended, not with a whistle, but with something far more terrifying. Absolute silence. The distant sounds of the Korean night, the wind through frozen pines, the occasional crack of ice, all stopped as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. The Chinese were moving into assault positions, close enough to silence the world. Dalton didn't wait for orders. He shifted slightly higher in the trench, resting the cold barrel on the frozen sandbag. He scanned the black mountainside through his scope, focusing on a cluster of rocky outcrops marking the center of the expected assault corridor. He controlled his breathing, a technique perfected through years of competitive shooting in Montana. 1 heartbeat, 1 sight picture, 1 neutralized threat. He saw movement, a shadow gliding low between boulders. A Chinese scout, perhaps 100 yards ahead of the main force, probing for weak points in the American line. Distance, exactly 220 yards. The scout paused, a dark shape against slightly lighter snow. Dalton didn't breathe. The reticle settled on the center of the scout's chest. The custom trigger snapped like breaking glass. The .222 Remington round left the barrel traveling so fast it was nearly silent until impact. The scout simply vanished, erased by the strike. No shout, no warning cry, no signal to the men behind him. Just a soft collapse into the snow. The silence returned, but heavier now. The enemy knew they'd been detected, but couldn't comprehend how. Dalton worked the bolt. The spent brass ejected into frozen dirt with metallic clink, 4 rounds left in the magazine. He was alone, outnumbered, armed with a rifle everyone had dismissed, and he just eliminated the advance scout for a regiment-sized human wave assault. When the main attack came, it would be the moment he'd either be proven a genius or torn apart as a fool. The death of the scout changed the tactical picture, but it didn't stop the inevitable. The Chinese commander knew what that single silent shot meant. The American line was alert and watching. He wouldn't hesitate. He'd simply accelerate the assault timeline. Dalton chambered the next round. He was ready. At 0200 hours, the mountain exploded with sound. It wasn't a cautious advance. It was a tsunami of humanity and noise, a collective roar rising from the frozen slopes and crashing against the American positions. The human wave attack. Hundreds of Chinese infantrymen screaming, bugles blaring, surging through the darkness. Their strategy: use overwhelming numbers and psychological terror to shatter defenders before they could organize effective resistance.
The Garand and .30 caliber machine guns of Baker Company erupted in a thunderous chorus, throwing walls of lead into the charging darkness. Tracers arced across the night sky like deadly fireflies. But volume wasn't stopping the charge. The Chinese were trained to absorb casualties and maintain momentum. The wave was accelerating, a living, desperate mass aimed directly at Dalton's exposed salient. Dalton didn't panic. The screaming, the gunfire, the chaos all faded into background static. His world narrowed to the sight picture in a scope and the impossibly smooth action of his Remington. He wasn't an infantryman holding a position. He was a precision instrument, and he was about to prove his small-caliber rifle was the most effective man-stopper on the peninsula. His first priority, leadership targets. The assault would be led by officers and veteran NCOs carrying whistles and directing fire. Their presence was essential to maintaining cohesion. Dalton had to decapitate the attack. The charge was at 400 yards, still 200 yards from the main American defensive line. Dalton found his target, a figure running ahead of the others, moving with purpose and authority. An officer, identified by his position and the whistle raised to his lips. Dalton took a breath. The trigger broke cleanly. The shot, traveling at over 3,000 feet per second, hit the officer with force utterly disproportionate to the bullet's size. The man didn't slow or stagger. He simply ceased to function as a living organism. Hydrostatic shock shattered his internal systems, dropping him backward with violent finality. The sudden catastrophic death of their leader, without sound, without warning, just instant collapse, caused a visible ripple of confusion. Men following him hesitated, uncertain whether he'd been hit by artillery or stepped on a mine. Dalton was already working the bolt. He didn't confirm the kill. He didn't need to. The bolt snapped back, ejecting the spent casing into the frozen dirt, driving the next round hole with mechanical precision. Next target, heavy weapons. 3 Chinese soldiers moving left were carrying a Type 24 heavy machine gun. If they established that weapon, they'd sweep the American trenches and end the defense in minutes. Distance, 350 yards. Shot 2. The bullet struck the lead gunner instantly. The man crumpled. The heavy weapon fell, its bipod splaying uselessly in the snow. Before the ammunition bearer could react, Dalton was moving. Shot 3. The second soldier, reaching for the fallen weapon, was neutralized just as quickly. Shot 4. The third soldier, attempting to drag the gun to cover, collapsed mid-stride. 3 shots, 3 kills. The most dangerous immediate threat eliminated, lying in the snow as useless steel. Total elapsed time, less than 6 seconds. Dalton was shooting faster than many men could shoot a semi-automatic, and targets were dropping with catastrophic finality that the heavy Garand rounds couldn't replicate. But the human wave wasn't slowing. The noise was deafening. The confusion on the left flank was being absorbed by the relentless pressure of troops behind them. They surged forward, bayonets fixed, driven by doctrine and desperation. Distance shrinking rapidly. 300 yards. Dalton had 1 round left in the magazine. He saw 4 men attempting to recover the machine gun, a salvage team trying to bring the weapon back into action. He couldn't get all 4, but he had to stop the recovery. Shot 5. The round hit the central soldier, instantly vaporizing the recovery effort. His 3 companions recoiled in shock, unable to comprehend the invisible deadly force picking them off with surgical precision. Dalton didn't give them time to process. His left hand grabbed the second magazine, fingers moving in practice precision honed through thousands of repetitions. He dropped the empty magazine, slammed the full one home, and worked the bolt in one fluid motion. Click-snap. Magazine seated, bolt closed, Remington loaded. The 3 remaining soldiers, realizing the threat was coming from a fixed, devastatingly accurate position, broke for cover. Shot 6. The soldier closest to the rocks disappeared into a snowdrift. Dalton had killed 7 men, 6 with a bolt-action rifle in less than 45 seconds. He neutralized the entire heavy weapons team and eliminated the command structure. The charge was still 250 yards away. He was a single man who created a barrier of impossible instantaneous death. But the enemy was adapting. The remaining troops spread out, using terrain and darkness for concealment. They were trained to counter machine gun fire, but had no doctrine for countering a single sniper firing hypervelocity rounds with supernatural accuracy. The charge morphed from a concentrated wave into broken, rapidly moving assault groups. They were no longer charging his front directly. They were attempting to flank him, using the rocky terrain and dead ground, distance down to 200 yards. He could hear them now, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the ragged breathing, the clink of equipment striking stone. He shifted focus to the right flank. A rifle barrel emerging from behind a boulder. The soldier was moving fast, trying to bypass the killing field he'd created. Shot 7. The round struck through the edge of the boulder. Risky shot, betting the .222's velocity would carry through the fractured stone. The bullet fragmented, but the core was efficient. The soldier spun and collapsed, creating momentary panic in the movement behind him. Dalton's hands were numb with cold, but the bolt moved flawlessly. The smell of burned powder was thick in the frozen air. 8 men neutralized. The enemy's response was immediate. They'd pinpointed his position and opened fire with their rifles. Heavy rounds smashed into sandbags. Dirt, ice, and stone fragments sprayed across his helmet, stinging his face. The impact was overwhelming. He pressed into the bottom of the trench. Remington clutched tight against his chest, waiting for the suppressive fire to pause. The Chinese thought they'd pinned him. They thought they'd neutralized the threat. They didn't understand the man with the small caliber rifle. Dalton waited 4 heartbeats. Enemy fire shredding sandbags above his head. Then he moved not backward, but upward, swinging the Remington toward the muzzle flashes, eyes searching for targets. Distance, 100 yards. He didn't expose his head. He slowly pushed the barrel through a gap between sandbags, keeping low, abandoning the scope, shooting through instinct and peripheral vision. First man advancing in a low crouch, rifle raised, scanning for movement. Too close, too confident. He paused to signal the soldiers behind him. Fatal mistake. Shot 8. The trigger broke in pure muscle memory. The supersonic round hit chest and shoulder. The soldier dropped without sound, rifle clattering across frozen rocks. The instant silence of the kill was psychologically devastating to the men behind him. Dalton worked the bolt in pure automation, fluid and fast. He didn't wait for their reaction. He swung left toward urgent Chinese voices. Second man moving into flanking position, trying to get an angle on the trench. Shot 9. Round struck center mass. Catastrophic effect. The tiny hypervelocity bullet tore him apart from the inside, dropping him instantly. 2 shots, 9 kills total. A visible corridor of bodies now marked his field of fire. The human wave attack had been brought to a complete, terrifying halt directly in front of his position. Chinese soldiers behind the first assault line, seeing their comrades obliterated by an invisible precision force, stopped dead. The roar of the charge was replaced by uncertain, gasping silence, broken only by the distant crump of American mortar fire. Dalton had stopped a regimental assault faster than a heavy machine gun position. The enemy was stalled, but still present, still close enough to throw grenades or launch a final desperate rush. He had to convert momentary shock into permanent rout. 1 round left in the magazine. The next threat wouldn't be frontal. They'd use explosives. He scanned the terrain, searching for a soldier preparing to throw. He saw it. The dull glint of metal near a cluster of boulders, 60 yards out. A soldier pulling the pin on a stick grenade, preparing to lob it into his trench. High priority moving target. Time available, less than 2 seconds. Dalton aimed slightly ahead, predicting the trajectory of the man's throwing arm as he cocked back. Shot 10. The round, placed with impossible precision, hit the soldier's arm and upper chest as he prepared to release. The impact was so violent the soldier's body snapped sideways. The grenade dropped at his feet. It exploded a second later, a useless concussive burst that harmed only the thrower. The absolute surgical violence of that interception was too much. The remnants of the assault force, realizing the man in the trench wasn't just a rifleman, but a supernatural instrument of destruction, stopped fighting and started retreating. The screams of attack turned to frantic shouts of withdrawal. Dalton, breathing hard but completely controlled, grabbed his final magazine. 5 fresh rounds. 3 soldiers scrambling backward, abandoning cover, running for their lives toward the ridge. He couldn't let them retreat and regroup. They had to understand the price of assaulting this position was death, immediate and absolute. Shot 11. He chose the rearmost runner, the one most likely to rally others, aiming for lower spine. The .222 struck with devastating finality. The runner went down, immobilized. Shot 12. He swung to the second man, cutting diagonally through rocks. Clean hit. Chest shot. Instant collapse. Shot 13. He found the last target, a soldier diving behind a fallen tree. Dalton aimed low, betting on ricochet off the frozen ground beneath the log. The round struck ice, sending up a plume of snow and splinters. The man didn't move, either hit by fragments or completely pinned by fear. The battlefield fell into stunned silence. Distant Garans still firing on the flanks. Mortars continuing their rhythmic work. But in Dalton's sector, the fight was over. The charge had broken. The mountain swallowed the remnants, leaving behind a silent testament to immediate death in the frozen darkness. Dalton lowered the Remington, barrel steaming in the sub-zero air. He slowly stood, pushing sandbags aside, covered in dirt, ice, and powder residue, but completely unharmed.